Hey folks, welcome back. So today I want to do a kind of a quick unboxing slash initial impression reviews for the half blowback CO2 version of the Glock 17. This is a Gen 3 model, as you can tell from the grip here. And it's a CO2 and it's half blowback. And I've always wondered because these tend to be I find them to be a little bit more affordable than the full-sized or the full-size gas blowback versions that run on CO2 or even green gas. And so I wonder, what is it like exactly? Is it worth the money? And what exactly does he mean when he means half blowback? So let's start off with that. The half blowback system is a little bit different in the sense that they still will blow back completely or halfway, and it's quite a significant amount, but just not quite as the full version. So essentially, it is half. So the name essentially means what it means. But there are more subtle differences actually that are more important that we'll go into because they operate slightly differently. Now, I've only had this gun for about 5 months or so, and so I've only put through about maybe 500 rounds, especially since it's CO2. I ran out of cartridges for a while ago, and so it's hard for me to actually do a more extensive review. But I think it's enough to kind of get like a basic understanding idea of what's going on, and we can kind of get into the details later on as we progress. So once we get more experience with these guns and more rounds downrange, we can kind of do an update reviews as we normally do. But this is the package that it comes in right here. It's your standard plastic wrapping package with the very nicely engraved Glock logos, standard for all the now Umarex or Elite Force type of packaging with the official Glock trademarks and logos on it. The velocity is labeled at 330 FPS, CO2, blah, 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 standard stuff. Same thing, nothing down here except some packaging for as you see here, it's the wrenches, the Allen wrenches to adjust the hop-up and to remove and install the CO2 cartridges in the magazine. I've kept this for a while. I can finally get rid of this. The only reason I kept this package is for the video review here, so I can finally toss that now. Anyway, let's go back to the gun itself. I think this is actually a really awesome gun right here. I was surprised, a little disappointed in some areas, but actually very impressive others. Just as a side note, it does not include this tactical Glock light right here. This is the APL Enforce light for the real steel Glock, and as you can see, the dimensions work just as well on this as it does with any real steel products, original or the full blowback. So that's the point in its favor. I will say, starting with the looks department, right? This gun, the trademarks, as you can see in this logo, is missing the 9x19 caliber markings on the side, even though it has very distinct Glock trademarks, the model number, country of origin, and of course, Glock logo on the frame, Glock logo on the base of the magazine, and Glock logo on the side, as well as the barrel serial number. Again, these are never unique. These are just, well, actually I take that back. Sometimes they are, but not in the cases where they're located right here. Occasionally, they will have a unique serial number at the base of the gun, such as this one down here, but not always. Anyway, and then the standard official product, licensed product of Glock. Again, my opinion on that by now, right? I have always wished they kept it true to the original and did what it should be, which is the one right here, is made in Austria, Glock Inc., Smyrna, Georgia. But for some reason they went with this, and I just, whatever, right? Everything else is there, they might as well should have fixed that. But anyway, I want you to compare for a second though, because even though this is on the cheaper end of the model, I think the engravings that were done here were a lot better than the full gas blowback version that ran on green gas. And so if you compare it now, look at this one. This is the full gas blowback version. And as you can tell, or maybe not, it's a lot harder to tell the engravings here, and part of that could be because of the lighting and the texture of the slide here. But as you can see, it's not as distinctive. You kind of, I mean, you can tell it's obviously there. You know, the Glock trademark, the model, Gen 4, Austria, country of origin, and then this has a 9x19 trademarked right there, and the Glock logo on the polymer lower frame. If you switch to the side, same thing, licensed product Glock, and logo's there. This one doesn't have the logo on the side; it kind of moves it to the top right there, as you can see. So that's, you know, you could argue maybe it's possibly the Gen 4 to a different model, but either way, right, this is a lot more distinct and a lot more close to the real steel, I think, the original. So I think that's a point in the favorite here, despite being the cheaper quality of it. So that's actually pretty nice, despite not having the caliber markings, which is a problem. What I was going to say next is that the slide material actually is also more similar to the real steel, in my opinion, when I've compared the two. This is more of a smoother material. This is the original, or the full blowback version is a little bit more of a grainier texture, it's just kind of different, I think, but this is not as realistic as this one right here, even though this one's a little bit shinier. The material on this one right here is kind of more of like a zinc alloyed, so they're a little bit cheaper to make. And the reason I say zinc alloyed, I'm not 100% sure, is because the only place I've seen, you know, videos is like a ICS, this one ICS factory, and they kind of just basically say it's a zinc alloy mixed together to make the slides. That's the only place I've ever seen information on what these slides are made out of. Contrasting with this one though, the operation of the gas blowback with the CO2 cartridge is a lot more intense, and so they need to up the slide material right here to a much stronger material. I believe this is more of an aluminum based product rather than a zinc alloy, but this is definitely, hear that? Definitely a lot tougher material than this one right here, which is also another good thing. The downsides, though, however, is that this is where it gets kind of lame. These are not your standard Glock sight. I mean, they look that way, right, of course, in terms of functionality, but they're actually molded into the slide as one piece, all right? So as you can see there, molded in there. Same thing with the front sight post. You can't remove them and put on your real steel Glock sights, or even your night sights, whatever you're looking for, unlike the gas blowback versions right here. Hop-up unit is also located in a very interesting place. It's easily to access, that's for sure. It's right there. Use the Allen key that comes with the gun to change that. Whereas on the the green gas version, you have to tear down the slide and adjust up the hop-up wheel beneath the barrel. So from a realism standpoint, that goes to this one here. But from a practicality standpoint, obviously this one wins. The other thing, though, now let's get into things that are kind of, and we're still talking about appearances now for the most part. I know we kind of segued a little bit, but let's stick with the appearances for now. This is where things kind of go wrong for this gun. Actually, one more good thing. The polymer, the lower polymer frame on this side, on this Gen 3 model here, is very nice. I would say they're very similar. But I do feel like this one just feels sturdier. It feels like it's a more a sturdier polymer than this lower frame. They're very, very similar, but this just has that slight edge, and it could just be because this is newer and it just looks a little bit better. It's hard to say, but I would, if I had to kind of choose, I'd probably go with this one right here. But now let's do the bad things. So, because this is a half blowback system, the parts of it are built not very, I guess to say, accurate to the true steel. And what I mean by that is, if you're a collector and you're buying this from a collector standpoint, you might be kind of annoyed by some of the things they have here. So, for example, this pin here isn't supposed to exist there. That's just not where it's supposed to go. This is more accurate to the real steel right here. Again, I know this is Gen 4, but they're similar enough to compare. This pin should not be there. These pins right here are just actually where the real steel have pins are. these are just mock holes that are molded into the polymer frame. They're not real pins. There's another pin right here where the takedown levers are supposed to be for the Glock. So they replace that with pin, and this is obviously a mock takedown lever because you can't take that down in here. It's not. It's just a molded piece of plastic. This version right here, right? You can see that's where you would pull that down in order to strip the slide off if you would need to strip the gun. No pins or anything like that. It's just a connecting point. If you really want to compare it to a Gen 3 to a Gen 3, this is a different model. This is a WE with a HT3, I can't remember, but it's basically WE upper frame with the full trademarks on it. But again, same thing, no pin there, and has the actual takedown levers and kind of a pin where it should be right there. And then same thing goes with the back too. As you can notice right here, this pin right here is the actual pin that's holding the internals together. This pin right there is a mock pin. That pin is just a molded piece just for the sake of trying to keep the original form in mind. Again, this is the only pin that should be there holding it together. Nothing right here, and that's how it should be. Again, this is the WE model. This is the Elite Force model right here. Same thing. That's the actual pin right there. Triggers next is another thing. Look at the trigger of this model right here, right? Take a good look at that. It's the world famous Glock trigger, right, with the safety there. Looks like that, right? Same thing. This is identical almost to the WE version. Same thing, right? But then look at this trigger here. It looks a little bit more curved, right? It's still there. The safety trigger is still there, right? But it seems a little bit more curved. And again, these are more mocked pins located in there for the sake of trying to adhere to the original replica as much as possible. But it just looks a little off, right? And so let's again compare them in frame. So they look a little different. Not enough to, like, anyone looking, unless you're looking at it carefully, you wouldn't really notice the difference. But hey, since we're going to nitpick today, that's what we'll point out. Okay. Again, real pins on this one right here, molded pins on this one. So get used to that pattern throughout the day. Let's flip it around. Again, the back part right here is just a molded piece. Point out right here, that's just the molded piece right here. Whereas with this gun, the true Elite Force one, this part actually is removable, and you can replace it with the real steel polymer back plating right there. Again, this whole slide is just a molded piece that kind of is one package in one, limiting the ranges of aftermarket parts if you were to choose to do so, if it even exists. But a lot of folks want to do like real steel compatibility replacement parts, and that's just not going to be possible. Another thing, again, this this extractor right here is molded into the slide. Again, it's not a functional, it's never functional, but this is molded, it's not a separate piece, unlike the gas blowback version, which is it's a separate piece right here. As you can tell, it's being moved separately from the slide. Honestly, though, I will say that having the extractor as a separate piece looks more realistic in terms of authenticity and faithful to the original replica. But the problem with that is it's harder to clean because, again, grease and oil gets caught in that area, and you have to basically take out a lot of parts in order to remove that and clean it down. And as you can see in this model here, I always got grease just leaking out of that part because it's all like sandwiched in there. And you can try to wipe it as much as you can, but after a while it just comes back out there again. Whereas with this one here, there aren't any gaps in there because it's the fake one, right? It's molded in there, so you won't have that issue. There are some trade-offs with realism and functionality, so that's one area that I thought was kind of interesting to point out. So the magazine, okay, the good thing about this magazine is that it's still a full-size magazine. A lot of the CO2 models out there, they use the magazines, they store the CO2 cartridge in here. And then the magazine part that actually holds the ammunition is actually just a stick magazine. So it's like a very thin piece, which makes it very difficult to carry around with you because the base plate is still the same size, but instead of having a full-size magazine, it's only like, you know, this big or something. It's a very thin one. So this is not the case. And you can carry multiple magazines with it. The downside, of course, is this is just a single stack magazine. It should be a double stack magazine, as most Glocks are, except for the pocket pistol version, like the Glock 42 and 43 model, which are single stack magazines. But by and large, the Glock 17 model should be double stacked. These hold up to 14 rounds. You load them as you normally would. You pull it down, and you can just put rounds to the top right there. Okay, and then of course the Glock magazine down here. Or the logo down here. Let's talk about, so from a collector standpoint and from just a looks aspect of it, you know, it's not as bad as it looks. You know, it's reasonable for the price, but there are definitely, I think, you know, parts of it that aren't supposed to be there, and molded parts that are just not as realistic as it can be. The other part I forgot to mention is the barrel. So look how the barrel kind of flares out right here. It looks kind of like a musket barrel, right? It's right here. So if you can tell right there, compare that to the CO2 version or the gas blowback version, where this is more authentic to the real CO. It should be the same length the entire time. There's no flaring of the magazine right there. And no, that's not a Gen 3 versus Gen 4 thing. That's just I don't know why they did that. The barrel, by the way, is plastic. The inner barrel, of course, is going to be metal, but the outer barrel, what we're looking at here, is plastic. So when you want to remove the orange tip that comes with it, you kind of have to break it off. You can't use the fire technique that we talked about before. And I'll show you a little video of it afterwards, or a picture of it afterwards. Okay, so that's from an aesthetic standpoint. I really don't think if you're a true collector of Glock, this is probably not something you're going to want to get. But yeah, it's just, I mean, it's not bad. It's better than I thought it would be. And from a blowback standpoint, oh, I forgot to mention again, from a blowback standpoint, it's not a full blowback, right? So it's only partial. So if you were to compare it to this one right here, this is a full blowback. Look at the difference in which they lock back. This one locks back right. It's half blowback, and I'll rearrange it so there's no bias there. But you can tell they're just half blowbacks. Now, one thing that does make it aesthetically problematic is that because this is a half blowback, they have to move the notch right here for the slide lock further back in order for it to catch, because it doesn't go back as much. Whereas on this one right here, right, the notch here should be way forward like this. It should be kind of near where this little takedown lever is. But this one right here was pushed all the way back from right here to here in order to accommodate for that. And the cutout is a lot wider than it should be compared to this one right here. So there's that. Okay, so that was all just aesthetics. Now let's go into the next part of this video where we really talk about the functionality of the gun, because I think this is where it actually really shines. Not that the aesthetics didn't, I mean, but it just, you know, it's not going to be quite the collectible piece item that people have, understandably because of the cost. Still very good, but just not quite what people are probably going for. All right, so let's go over to the performance of the gun now. Okay, so let's take the rest of the part of this video to kind of just look at the function of the gun. And so let's do a quick shooting test to show you. This gun really performs, I think, very solidly from a skirmish standpoint, and if you were actually to use it. Even though it didn't stack up, that great when we were talking about in terms of collectability and authenticity to the original piece, when you're firing it, the recoil, I think, at least when you're on a full CO2 cartridge, is very crisp. The trigger pull is it's actually very tough though. I don't know how many pounds it is, but it's definitely a lot more than the full gas blowback version. And I kind of noticed like a lot of these CO2 powered guns are actually, the trigger pull are a lot heavier compared to their green gas counterpart. I'm not really sure why, but it's just mainly the mechanism of it. The other thing I want to point out though is that again, I haven't had a whole lot of time to go through all of these rounds, and usually 500 rounds just kind of gives you like a glimpse of what it does, rather than and it's not quite super accurate, right? But it's enough to talk about it. The interesting thing is that as a half blowback, it's not. Look at this is without the magazine in it, right? And if you can tell, the innards are very different from a full blowback. And what I mean by that is that, look at this one here. If I slide it back, that's the nozzle right there. It will load in the rounds from the magazine, push it into the gun, and fire when ready. The Glock model operates on that Browning system where when you fire it, right, the barrel is supposed to travel with the slide for a little bit, right, before it hits a certain point where it drops and starts basically tilting down. And when it tilts down, the feed ramp tilts down, allows the next round to be cycled in or pushed into the chamber of the gun before it be lifted back up again and pushes forward. So again, the motion is barrel moves along with the slide after a certain amount, then it hits a point where it drops down, tilts down, and allows the loading ramp to tilt towards the rounds. When the slide goes forward, it'll push that round up that loading ramp into the barrel chamber, and then push back up and lock back into place. That's just accurate to the real steel. This one, however, does no such thing. It does not really act on the same Browning principle where the barrel tilts down a little bit. The barrel stays where it does and does not move at all, as you can see in this picture or this film right here. See? And actually, it's interesting because the rounds actually aren't stored in the chamber of the gun like the original steel. Once you cycle a slide, chamber around it's in the chamber, in the hop-up unit, and ready to fire the next round. You pull it. This one actually, all the rounds are located inside the magazine, right? And this is essentially the chamber. So when you load a round in the magazine and put it in here, if you pull the slide back to lock it back, every time when I pull the trigger, it's not going to fire, even though there's a loaded magazine in there. And what happens is that pushes, when you pull the trigger, right, that little section, it pushes a round into the chamber, so to speak, and fires, right? And then when you release it, a new round will pop up into the magazine and / chamber, because it all happens within this unit right there, right? And that essentially pushes into next round when you fire it. So the chamber, magazine, is really essentially in the same place. Once you pull the trigger and this pushes it forward and fires and releases the gas, the rest of the gun basically serves as the barrel. So it's kind of a different operating system compared to what you're normally used to seeing. So which means that if your slide is locked back to the rear and you keep pulling the trigger, you're basically not firing the gun, but you're essentially cycling through all the rounds in the magazine and dumping it out, and it will fall out of the front of the barrel right there. So that's obviously different from a gas blowback like this one right here, because if you were to lock the slide back and pull the trigger, nothing would happen because obviously it doesn't cycle the same way, right? It's not going to cycle slides or cycle rounds into the chamber. If you want to unload a magazine and dump it out of the barrel, you have to basically manually cycle the slide like this each time, which is a little bit more realistic, in terms of functionality than this one. But there you go. I think for the most part, it's pretty solid though. Minor differences in terms of how it operates, the extent in which it blows, the slide moves back to the rear. But very solid performing gun. In terms of FPS, as advertised, it says, if you saw in the box earlier, it says 330. When I chronoed it myself, it was around 330, 345, 340, so it's within that range. Obviously, it depends on the CO2 cartridge that you use. And the temperature, temperature does affect it a little bit, but it does affect all of that. And it's pretty close to that, 14 rounds in a magazine. Occasionally, if I had issues where the slide doesn't lock back to the rear, even though the end magazine's empty, I've just kind of started noticing that recently. So, by the way, slide really still works as the original, so I'll push this down, right? The magazine's empty right now, but I'm going to push it down. And this is going to be a dry fire, by the way. So when the magazine's empty, you'll notice how it's pushing up on the slide release, right? If I let go, it's going to be pushed up. So that way when you fire it, it should lock back. I don't know if it will lock back or not in this one, so let's see what happens. See? I just fired it, but it didn't lock back, even though the magazine was empty. And you pull it back and it'll lock back to the rear like that. So sometimes I've noticed that's been happening. That's never really been an issue for me for the gas blowback, the CO2 or the green gas version here, but it does happen a little bit with this one. It doesn't happen when I have rounds in the chamber or the magazine. I'm firing, and then when it runs out, then it'll lock back. But for some reason, when I put it in an empty magazine and do that, it doesn't seem to work. But most of the time, folks don't just put in an empty magazine and dry fire for the sake of dry firing. So overall, what are my conclusions? Well, I think this gun is, for the price, I think it's a very, very reasonable purchase. Depending on what you're looking for. If you are, kind of looking for a Glock, I don't want to say look-alike, but basically a Glock, right? And you want a gun that's pretty reliable for skirmishes, pretty good build quality, and performs pretty nicely, and you're not so big on the nit-gritty details of how authentic it is to the original copy of the Glock, I think this is going to be a pretty good, decent buy for you. And of course, you have to be into CO2. If you're kind of a green gas person, then obviously this is not going to be an option for you, even if it didn't have any of the cosmetic issues. But if you're cool with that, and of the slight differences, then I think this is a very good buy. Performance-wise, like I said, it's pretty solid. I don't think you can really top it from that standpoint. Aftermarket parts are going to be pretty limited in these situations here. Because they're just not very common. These are the types of guns that if they break, you're probably better off just buying a new one. But so far, they've been pretty reliable. And it's funny because I've actually had this gun, the CO2 cartridge, in here for about the last 4 or 5 months. I just haven't taken it out yet. And that's supposed to be bad because it kind of wears down or it kind of deforms the rubber O-ring seal in here and it causes issues. But I've done it with that stress test for that Umarex P99 and never had any issues. And again, with this one right here, haven't had any issues myself. So there's that. Again, so I would say, yeah, I probably would buy it then if you were looking for what I was just talking about. But if you already own, say, like a bunch of different Glocks, and say here's like a Stark Arms Glock 19 Gen 3 right here. If you already own like a bunch of these already, or already a huge collector of Glocks, I think it might not really be a worthy investment. I was just kind of, what really got me into it is, like, I was just curious, like, how can there be like a $80 Glock or something like that, and it's considered a blowback. Like, what is that, And there's some trade-offs from it, but overall not bad. If I had to choose between this one or that one, what do you think I would take? Probably this one, honestly. I'm just more of a fan of how, because I'm more of a collector rather than a scrimmage. And again, these gas blowbacks right here. This is the G17, the Glock 19, or sorry, Glock 17 right here. This is also just as adequate for the reasons of if you want to use it in competition or whatever. This would just be as good as this one right here. Obviously, it's a different system that it uses, and just a more accurate replication of the original steel. But the price you pay obviously is literally the price. It's just more costly. Some parts, like we talked about, was the quality was a little bit different. But I think, there are always going to be trade-offs, and I just want to highlight those for y'all to see and make the decisions for yourself to see whether it's something you would want to invest in. Either way, you can't go wrong with either one of them. Just it depends on what you're looking for. I hope that y'all found this a little bit helpful, and in terms of what to do with the review of the gun. If there are any questions, comment below. As I use this a little bit more and I get more CO2 cartridges in, we'll do more reviews of this and kind of talk more about the performance of it, and from a long-term standpoint, not so much of a kind of an unboxing / initial impressions. So hope you all have found that helpful, and see y'all next time.